Good evening, community. My name is Fernando, and I want to share with you something very, very disturbing that happened to me 2 years ago when I was working as a truck driver. In fact, I have to say that this was the reason I decided to quit my job, even though the pay was not bad at all. But I felt that no amount of money was worth risking my life in this way. By that point, I had already experienced several incidents, like attempted robberies and that sort of thing. But the following experience I'm about to tell you crossed my limits. It was something so strange that I don't even know if it was paranormal or just something very sinister. But it was so terrifying that I no longer had the desire to continue working as a trucker. I remember that last trip as if it were yesterday. I hit the road in the afternoon and was supposed to reach my destination by 7 a.m., so I had a long way to go, and the night was just beginning. I stopped for food at my favorite taco stand and was eating on the way while listening to music and watching the sun set further and further until it became completely dark. I was driving completely normal, as this route had become almost routine, and I no longer needed to use the map on my phone. I knew where I had to go to arrive without any problems. However, I didn't account for a major accident involving several cars that had occurred, and because of that, traffic was being diverted to take another road to go around, as it was clear there would be no passage there for a good while. I had no choice but to follow the diversion, as no one was being allowed through, and it seemed like it would be a long wait because they still had to move all the cars and hadn't even started removing the bodies. So, I turned on the map on my cell phone to see which was the quickest route to get back on my original path. As I mentioned before, I had to deliver the cargo by 7 a.m. The map suggested a detour that would only take about 10 minutes to get back on the original highway, so I didn't think twice and headed towards that route. It didn't take long to find it. As soon as I arrived, I noticed that indeed there was this dirt road, but it was in very good condition and quite wide. I knew my truck wouldn't have any problem going through there. I was driving on this road, which was, in fact, quite lonely as there was no other vehicle around. Even so, it was a very beautiful landscape. I could see the silhouettes of the mountains in front of me in the distance, and the stars looked much brighter. I was contemplating the landscape and listening to music when suddenly, I noticed my phone signal had disappeared, and consequently, the music stopped playing. I could no longer see my location on the map or know where I was on the road, which worried me a bit, but I thought the signal would come back soon. However, it didn't. I continued driving, and the signal didn't return, nor did I see any road nearby. Without a map or phone to ask for help, I decided to keep driving until I reached the highway, which, according to the map, was only 10 minutes away. But after 20 minutes of driving, I still couldn't see the end of that road. I was getting scared and thought about turning back, but then I saw a light on in the distance. I didn't know what it was until I got closer and saw it was a small material house with a light on. My first thought was how awful it must be to live out here, completely isolated from everything. But beyond that, I had no bad feelings about the house. I decided to pull over and get out to ask if this road truly led to the highway, or if I should turn back, as I couldn't afford to waste more time. I got out of the truck and walked up to the house, where I noticed the windows had the curtains open. Not wanting to bother anyone or be disrespectful, I thought about peeking in to see if anyone was there before knocking. So, I walked up to one of the windows and was completely shocked to see 2 men and a woman sitting at a large table, eating what appeared to be a giant pig, which was alive and moaning in pain. It seemed they had opened its stomach, and from there, they were eating in a very desperate manner. I can't even explain how unreal and morbid it all was, but they were eating with their hands, tearing the poor pig apart, completely covered in blood. I was horrified watching this grotesque scene and couldn't move. I didn't make a sound or move an inch of my body. Then, I saw the woman turn to look at me, and after her, the 2 men also turned. They got off the table, sat down on the chairs, took their cutlery, and continued to eat the pig, all the while simply smiling at me. I ran as fast as I could back to the truck, turned it around and sped away at the maximum speed the truck could manage. Many thoughts raced through my mind, especially questions that clearly no one could answer for me. But above all, I was overwhelmed with fear that those people might follow me. I kept looking back almost every second to see if anyone was behind me, but no one was. Minutes passed until I finally emerged back onto the highway, and my phone signal returned. The first thing I did was call a friend of mine who is also a trucker to vent to him and tell him everything that had just happened. He couldn't believe it either. He tried to calm me down, as I told him I was going to quit, that I could no longer expose myself in that way. But he said the scare would pass, and that I wouldn't feel the same way later. However, I never changed my mind. As soon as I returned to my city, I talked it over with my wife, who was greatly shocked after I told her what had happened. She supported my decision to quit and look for another job, as she always got very nervous whenever I left and never liked the idea of me being a trucker because of the dangers on the roads. In the end, I found another job almost immediately, but I still can't get that disturbing scene out of my head. I don't know if they were humans or something else, but what I can tell you is that, although they looked human, they didn't act like it. I'll never know who they were and why they behaved so strangely, but believe me, I also lost any desire to find out. There are very strange things out there, things we are not aware of. Be very careful on the roads and don't make the same mistake I did. Don't take roads you don't know just to get somewhere faster, because in the end, it might backfire and you could become the victim of something very dark. Good evening, everyone. I hope you are all well. My name is Raul Dominguez, and I worked as a transporter for about 10 years for a construction materials company that also provided me with the truck. During this time, I made some good friends who were my colleagues, and I met them often on the road. We would chat during breaks or when we stopped at food stands. With this context, I will begin to tell you this story, which I, my friends and family consider to be paranormal. One day I left to deliver cargo to another city with a colleague. It was a long way, so the two of us went together to make the trip quicker. While one slept, the other drove, and vice versa. The trip there went very smoothly. We delivered the materials and immediately headed back to our city. However, it was during the early hours of the morning on our way back when everything strange and unexplainable happened. I was driving, and my colleague was asleep in the bunk. It was around 3 a.m. I was listening to the radio to keep myself entertained and make the trip less tedious when my colleague woke up and mentioned he desperately needed to use the bathroom. However, at that moment, we were far from any gas stations or towns. According to the cell phone map, the next gas station was still an hour away, so I had no choice but to pull over to let my friend relieve himself in the wilderness. I veered off the road and parked to wait for my colleague, telling him not to take too long as the area was somewhat dangerous. He assured me he would be quick and ventured into the bush, where I could no longer see him. I waited in the truck with the radio on, listening to a news program, when suddenly the signal completely cut out. I reached for my phone for entertainment but found it had no signal, which was odd because just a minute before I had used it to send a message and it had worked fine with almost full bars. It was strange for the signal to disappear out of nowhere, but I didn't dwell on it much since we were on the highway, and such things can happen. I looked back several times to see if my colleague was returning but saw nothing. He was taking too long, and I felt very exposed in that place, especially without a signal anywhere. At this point, I was starting to worry and was about to get out to look for him when I saw him walking back from the bush. I rolled down the window and jokingly asked if he was sick from the stomach, among other silly jokes. But he didn't even smile, which was very unusual since he was always cheerful. He just kept walking until he finally got back and sat in the passenger seat, which surprised me because it was his turn to sleep. Before this, he had only slept for about an hour, so I thought he would go back to the bunk. I started the truck and we drove off. I asked if he wasn't going to sleep, given it was his turn to rest before it was his turn to drive again at dawn, but he said he didn't need or want to sleep. Setting aside that matter, what struck me most was his attitude and the cold, curt way he responded, very unusual for him. I asked if everything was all right, genuinely wanting to know what had happened to make him act this way, but his only response was, "Everything is excellent." His gaze never left the front. He also looked up and then back at the road, but never turned to look at me, just straight ahead. The signal returned a few minutes after we drove away from that place. I was thankful because the silence and awkwardness with my companion were uncomfortable. So finally, I could listen to the news on the radio again. I didn't bother him further since it was clear he didn't want to talk, so we continued the rest of the way in silence. Hours passed and dawn was approaching. It would soon be his turn to drive, which worried me because he had barely slept. Honestly, I was nervous about going to sleep in the bunk, knowing he would be driving so tired and sleep-deprived. So I stopped at a gas station to buy us some coffee. I asked if he wanted to get down to prepare it himself and stretch his legs, since it was almost his turn to drive. But he said he didn't want coffee and that he wouldn't get down. The situation was beyond strange, but still, I got down to clear my head for a while and forget everything that was happening. While I was in the bathroom, I suddenly received a call on my cell phone from him, my colleague who was with me. I thought he had changed his mind and was calling to ask me to get something from the store. But as soon as I answered the phone, I heard him yelling at me, accusing me of how I could have left him in that place alone and not gone to see if something had happened to him. I was completely confused by what he was asking. I asked him to calm down and explain what he was talking about. In an irritated tone, he said, "You know what I'm talking about. Last night, you left me stranded in the bush to fend for myself. I think I fainted or something happened because I woke up lying in that place an hour ago. A man just helped me, and I'm on my way back to the city. How could you leave me there without checking why I was taking so long?" I swear I was speechless with shock. My heart started racing. For a moment I thought maybe he was playing a joke on me. So I ran out of the bathroom back to my truck, but there was no one there. There was no trace of my colleague or whatever it was that had come back with me. I called him back on the phone, asking if what he had just told me was true. He was too upset, saying that what I did was unacceptable, that anything could have happened to him there alone and unconscious, and that I should stop playing innocent as it only made him angrier. I tried to explain what happened, but after listening to me, he just laughed cynically and hung up. Clearly, he didn't believe me. After that, it took years for him to speak to me again. Following this incident, I had problems at the company where I worked because he filed a complaint, and it nearly cost me my job. Luckily, they didn't fire me because of my track record there. They knew I was trustworthy and always made deliveries on time and in perfect condition. But beyond that, I never found out who or what I actually picked up in my truck, who or what took on my friend's exact form and even his voice. It's something that remains unanswered, because to this day, I don't know what the heck happened. Everything was very strange, including the sudden loss of signal in that area, and my colleague not remembering anything that happened that night. He only remembers doing his business, and then everything went blank until the next morning when he woke up lying in that bush, very confused and with a severe headache. As much as my family and friends have tried to find some explanation, the truth is there isn't one. There are only theories, all of them paranormal, of course. It sends shivers down my spine just thinking about what got into my truck and kept me company for so many hours. Hello, community. Today I'd like to share a paranormal anecdote that happened to my uncle during one of his many trips as a truck driver. He has given me permission to tell this story, but without mentioning his name. He shares this story at every family gathering because it is quite shocking and hard for many to believe. But it really happened, and I say this because my uncle is a very serious man. He is not one to joke around or anything like that, and when he tells it, you can see the fear on his face as if reliving it causes him great discomfort. As I mentioned, my uncle worked as a truck driver, a job he has dedicated his whole life to, and he is actually about to retire. This happened in 2006 during one of his many trips. He says he was driving calmly on the highway around 1 in the morning. He was on a call with my aunt, and they were arguing over some trivial household matters. She was complaining about some tasks she had asked him to do before leaving, which he hadn't done. Suddenly, my uncle nearly lost control of the steering wheel when out of nowhere, a woman ran towards him in the middle of the highway. My uncle slammed on the brakes, dropping the phone, and he didn't even remember to pick it up to answer my aunt, who was on the other end of the line worried, asking what had happened. His gaze was fixed on the woman who had stopped in front of his truck, standing there, crying, asking for help. My uncle got out of the truck and asked her if she was okay, as he had nearly hit her, but all she could say was, "Help my baby, please help her," while crying inconsolably. My uncle asked where her baby was and what had happened, and the lady told him she was further ahead, that they had been in an accident and the little one was stuck in the baby carrier. She pleaded for his help to get her out. My uncle told her he would, of course, help, and immediately offered the woman to get into the truck so they could reach her car more quickly. The woman, still crying, sat in the passenger seat. He recounts feeling very nervous. My aunt kept calling the cell phone, but he had to hang up to call emergency services as it seemed no one had arrived at the accident scene yet to assist the woman and her daughter. After calling, they told him it would take about 20 minutes to arrive. He then hung up, and the woman, who hadn't stopped crying the whole time, indicated with her hand where her car was trapped. It turns out the car was trapped in some trees which prevented it from falling off a cliff, but it was so far down that it wasn't visible, and that's why no one had called emergency services yet. All he could think about at that moment was to save the little girl trapped there. He says the adrenaline he felt was so intense that he didn't even turn to see if the woman was following him or if she had stayed in the truck. He just ran to the car to get the girl out. When he got there, he saw the baby crying in the back seat of the car, but when he looked to the front, he noticed the entire front part was completely wrecked, and he saw what seemed to be the body of a woman in the driver's seat, wearing the same clothes and hair color as the woman who had asked him for help. My uncle felt a chill at that moment because he was sure it was her, but he didn't want to verify it because her body was in very bad condition, and he didn't want to see that. The only thing that mattered to him at that moment was to get the little girl, who wouldn't stop crying, out of there. He managed to get the baby out, who wasn't hurt, took her away from there, and kept her safe in his truck until the authorities arrived. By the way, the woman was nowhere to be found. After that, he finally answered my aunt's cell phone, who hadn't stopped calling out of concern. He told her he was okay, but then he told her what was happening. Eventually, an ambulance and 2 police cars arrived. My uncle told them what had happened, and of course it was very hard for the officers to believe him, but everything indicated that the accident had happened since the afternoon, because the paramedics said the woman had been dead for several hours, and it was already 2 in the morning at that point. My uncle gave his statement and handed the little girl over to the authorities, who of course were going to investigate if she had any family to take her to. After that, he left the place, more shocked than ever. He says that on the entire way, he couldn't stop crying. It was something that marked him for life. Just remembering the look of anguish and pain on that woman's face is something that still haunts him after so many years. He says he hopes that baby, who is now a young girl, is doing well and that she is with her family. There's no doubt that poor woman couldn't rest in peace, couldn't rest until she knew someone had rescued her daughter, who was in great danger in that place, unable to be seen by anyone. Hello everyone, My daughter convinced me to share this paranormal story that has been happening to me for a while, and after giving it some thought, I believe it is indeed worth telling. It was terrifying, and to this day, when I remember it, I get those chills from that night. First of all, my name is Carlos, and I have been working as a trucker for 15 years in Mexico. I remember I had just bought that trailer. It was my first trip with it since the one I had was very old, and had broken down from many things because I had made countless trips in it over the years. So, my wife suggested that I buy another one, even if it was used, but it should be more modern than what I had. That time, I got a job to deliver material to another city about 8 hours from where I lived back then, and it was time to debut the new truck that I had bought with much effort. I was very excited. I left around 5 p.m. on the road. I remember it was already very cloudy and starting to rain, but despite that, I had to do my job. The strange thing began to happen from the moment I got into that truck. All the time, I felt like a tingling in the back of my neck. I don't know how to explain it so you'll understand, but it felt as if someone was breathing right behind me, blowing on me. That was the sensation I had all the time since I got in. I would turn around out of inertia, but obviously there was no one there. I also started to feel my skin goosebump and many chills. I thought maybe it was because of the cold, although it had never happened to me before, and in truth, at that moment, I did not feel cold since I had the windows closed. So, I decided to turn on the heating to see if that weird sensation would go away, but it didn't work. As I mentioned, it wasn't cold what I was feeling, but a chill running through my body nonstop all the time. I never stopped feeling like someone was exhaling behind my neck. I turned around many times and even almost went off the road. In one of those times, I did not feel comfortable or calm, but quite the opposite. I felt anxious and could even say depressed for no reason because, on the contrary, I was very excited to be debuting my new truck before I started feeling all those things. The night fell, and I couldn't stop thinking that I just wanted to reach my destination and finish the job so I could finally return home. To calm down a bit, I decided to park at a small food stand on the road. It wasn't the first time I had been there because the stand is very famous among us truckers. Many of my colleagues also stopped there, and sometimes we met to have dinner or chat. I got out to order some food, and shortly after, a colleague of mine, who is also a very good friend, arrived. He approached me, smiling and greeting me warmly, as he always did. He asked how I was doing and if I was working, to which I replied that yes, I wouldn't leave my house in the truck otherwise, laughing with him. But then, he asked me a question that left me very confused. "So, you brought your son to work with you?" he asked. I told him no and asked why he would say that. He looked at me seriously and said that when he parked his truck next to mine, he saw a boy sitting in the passenger seat of my truck, who waved at him, but the boy didn't wave back and he thought it was my son because he had never seen my son in person. I asked him if he was joking, but his face was very serious, and he swore to me that it was true what he was telling me. We both went to the truck and I opened the door with some fear, but there was no one inside. In fact, I had locked the doors when I got out, so no child could have gotten inside. I noticed his nervous face when he saw that there was no one inside. He was touching his head as if he couldn't believe it, and kept swearing to me that he clearly saw a boy sitting there who had even waved at him. I told him I believed him because I remembered all those strange sensations I had felt throughout the journey. When I told him, he asked if the truck was new, to which I replied yes, that in fact, it was my first trip with it, and he said I had to get it blessed because it was very likely that there was some entity there. It was no coincidence what he had seen and what I had felt on the road. It was hard for me to believe in that. I was never one to believe in ghosts or anything like that, but he insisted that I get it blessed just in case, and then he asked me who I had bought it from. That's when I remembered that the man I bought it from was selling it urgently because he needed money for his young son's funeral. My friend looked at me as I told him that. with a face that seemed to have reached a conclusion about what was happening. "It can't be that that boy appeared in my truck. Ghosts don't exist," I told my friend. He didn't say anything more, just looked at me with a pitying face and touched my shoulder, kept repeating that I had to get the truck blessed if I wanted to continue using it. And after that trip, it was the first thing I did. I called the father of our church, and he blessed it. I swear to you that after that, I never felt that horrible sensation that I felt the first time, and nothing strange happened. Even so, I refuse to believe that there was an entity in my trailer. To this day, it's something that I find hard to accept, because all my life I was very skeptical, but I haven't been able to find another explanation. Thank you very much for listening to these stories. I hope you enjoyed them. I remind you to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell so you don't miss the upcoming videos. Good night to all.